Hey everybody, today I'm out in Tennessee taking a look at the 2025 Ford Bronco Sport. For this model year, the baby Bronco gets more than just an interior and exterior refresh. It gets a lot of improved capability, mainly thanks to the addition of this new Sasquatch trim. Let's take a look. Starting out with the design, obviously we get a slightly massaged front end in the other trims, but the big thing of course is the Sasquatch trim here, and that gets us the modular front bumper. This is a full steel bumper insert with the same thickness of steel that we find in the full-size Bronco. We also get recovery hooks, 2 up front and 2 in the rear. This is kind of a cool recovery hook design because, as you can see, it's a fully boxed recovery hook, and then they've given us a place where you can mount accessories like this brush bar. The underbody protection goes all the way from the front, all the way underneath the vehicle, and then all the way out there to the rear. So this is going to protect you in approach situations. Obviously, we have that brush guard functionality, and then we get underbody protection for the engine, the transmission, and the fuel tanks in the back. Moving around to the side, keep in mind again, this is the Sasquatch trim, and the Sasquatch trim is going to be available not just in the Badlands, but also the Outer Banks. So you can get both engines with the off-road bits here. The other thing you'll notice right here, new wheels and Territory RT tires from Goodyear. These are a much more aggressive all-terrain tire than we find in the competition. They're also 29-inch diameter tires, and that gives this about 0.6 of an inch of ground clearance improvement. And that brings this up just over 9 inches in terms of ground clearance, so at the moment it's certainly the highest off the ground. Out back, you'll notice no sheet metal has changed, so the core design of the Bronco Sport is still the same, and that means we still get this really high roofline in the back. That adds to a lot of cargo practicality and especially second row headroom, because you notice where that kink happens. It happens right back here in the area where the rear passengers' heads would be. It also gives it kind of a unique design, sort of a Land Rover vibe, I guess you could say, with a lot of that same practicality when it comes to the back. Now, speaking of the back end, let's move around here because we have the only separately opening glass in the segment. This is a feature I have loved ever since the Bronco Sport came out. It makes it a lot easier to reach in and grab cargo. Admittedly, this is not the biggest opening ever, but it does mean that things aren't going to roll out if you just want to reach in and grab your groceries, stuff like that. And of course, you can open the entire hatch if you want to. Why don't other car companies do this? Well, simply because it's more expensive, and a lot of car companies just don't want to add the extra expense. We'll take a look at that cargo area in just a moment. Down here, of course, we find the controls, so the glass and the door. We also find the backup camera positioned nice and centrally right there above the hitch in the back. And then a lot of the same off-road treatment back here that we found up front. So those metal plates in the back, big recovery hooks in the rear. Again, these are rated on the same durability testing scale that we find in the Bronco and the F-150. The hitch receiver, that's standard in this particular trim. We get a 4-pin wiring harness underneath, and this steel plate wraps all the way around but does not include the resonator in the back of the exhaust. Ford says that's because the exhaust system is a bit more forgiving, and obviously they don't want to trap anything around that resonator and that muffler back there because you don't want to start a fire when you're out there in the forest. Under the hood, we find the same engines that we found before, so purring along under this hood, since this is the Badlands trim, we find the 2-liter 4-cylinder turbo engine. There's also a 1.5-liter turbo in the base Bronco Sport. You're going to find that one also in the Outer Banks model, which you can get with all of the Sasquatch additions you find here. Now again, the Sasquatch package can be added to the Outer Banks trim and the top-end Badlands trim. But if you want a lot of what you see here without the suspension modifications for less money, you can get the Black Diamond package on the Big Bend trim. So basically 3 new off-road versions of the Bronco Sport. But a lot of what has made the Bronco Sport popular remains the same. And a lot of that has to do simply with the packaging and the size of this vehicle. Just check out that headroom. There is tons and tons available here, and this seat bottom cushion is actually not all the way on the ground. But if I hop in the back seat, you'll notice also how much room is going on back here and why. That bump up in the outer roofline gives us more headroom back here in the second row than you find in a Ford Expedition. And even though the Bronco Sport is not a terribly big vehicle, that adds so much extra practicality, because when the roofline is really slammed down like we find in most options in this segment, especially something like the Crosstrek, the front seats have to be more reclined. And in here you can sit more upright, which effectively gives you more room in the back. This is one of the few vehicles in this segment where you could probably put a rear-facing child seat behind someone of average height. We get air vents there in the rear, something that we don't find in all of the options. And if I fold these seats down, We get tons of cargo area inside for those journeys where you just need 2 people up front and a lot of your stuff in the back. Now, one thing worth noting is that the roofline does drop down here towards the hatch. So even though we have this really upright and boxy profile, the hatch opening, again above average, is not as large actually as the interior opening, but lots and lots of space, certainly room for bicycles and things like that inside here, and a lot more boxes than you'd be able to squeeze really in any of the competition. I know a lot of people tend to be a little bit confused about exactly how big the Bronco Sport is. I'll go ahead and move this chair around so Travis can come around to the back. The Bronco Sport is actually a sort of subcategory smaller than the Ford Escape, even though they're relatively closely related. But because it's so boxy and because it has so many practical touches, a lot of people assume that it's a bit bigger than it really is. One of those practical touches is back here with the separately opening rear glass. This is a feature I really, really love. And of course, if you want the entire hatch to open, you can pop it open right like that. Let's take a look inside, I guess, since we're here. This particular model has this kind of cool slide out cargo management tray. This is a Ford accessory with these feet that you can pull down there, and then you can lock this into place. If I find the right locking position, I'll let Travis come in close. You can see these locks right here. So this is how it actually snaps into place via these locking pins integrated into the rear, and that means that the shelf now is pretty fixed in place. So if you're camping and you want a place to prepare stuff, or if you're tailgating party to make things a little bit more accessible, you can go ahead and do that. And then you just unlatch it, and you can then either push it into the vehicle, or you can take everything completely out if you want to use the rest of the cargo area. So it's a really handy touch, actually. I really kind of like that cargo shelf. With that out of the back, you can see we have this really big and square cargo area back here. Under the load floor, we also have a full-size spare tire, something we don't find on average in this segment or even the next one larger. Although it is worth noting, this is a 225/65 R17, so it's not the exact tire size we find on the outside, and it is not an all-terrain tire because a 29-inch tire just wouldn't fit under the load floor. However, it is a full speed-rated tire, and that means that if you are towing 2,700 pounds, which is the up-level towing capacity for 2025 in this particular trim, you don't have to worry about a donut tire. As we take a look around the inside, keep in mind this is a Badlands trim with the Sasquatch package, so obviously things are going to be a little bit different in the other trims that are new or refreshed for 2025. On these front seat backs, we see a combination of fabric and leather upholstery and imitation leather upholstery around the interior as well. Yellow accents there, as well as yellow accent stitching. There's a Bronco logo embossed on the sides of the front seat back. We also have a storage pocket there, which is kind of cool, and storage pockets around the rear, which I'll show you in just a moment. These seats don't have terribly aggressive bolstering, so larger folks shouldn't have any trouble finding a comfortable position in these seats. The upholstery in the center sections is perforated, but it's not ventilated in this trim, just heated. Moving over to the doors, we find some soft touch plastics and a decent amount of hard touch plastics, as you'd expect in something with a relatively low price tag, starting right around $30,000. Hard plastics down there at the bottom of the door, soft touch armrest, and then kind of a semi-soft upper section. This is also a slush molded injection plastic, but it's not as cushy as some. We then find slightly different colors going on in some of the trim components that are basically the same as last year. Moving on to the dashboard, again sort of a rubbery, somewhat soft coating on the upper portion of the dashboard, hard plastics lower. Big bin-style glove compartment here, lots of storage capacity. I could probably fit maybe a 15-inch tablet computer inside there. That's actually quite a large storage area. Speaking of tablet computers, we have a big LCD in the dashboard. This is now over 13 inches. This is not running the latest Ford software. This is running Sync 4. So basically what we found in the pre-refresh Ford Explorer. It's not the Ford Digital Experience. I think that's okay because, again, low price tag was definitely the target with this particular system. It, of course, supports Android Auto and Apple CarPlay, but it doesn't support Google Mapping or some of those other features that you'll find in the Ford Digital Experience. Of course, it does have the full screen integrated mapping system there. Above that, we have the B&O center speaker in this particular trim, USB-C charge ports in this really handy storage tray, and they were happy to tell us that you can actually unbolt these little filler bolts and use those as camera mount points if you want, or accessory mount points. So if you're the kind of person that loves to bolt stuff onto your car, that's going to be a lot easier there. Also kind of a nice touch, we actually find Bronco written or sort of embossed in that little section, that little rubber pad around that big screen. Now speaking of big screens, we also find a just over 12-inch LCD instrument cluster over here. That is also going to be standard in the new Bronco Sport. And then moving out from there, we find basically the same steering wheel that we found before, Bronco logo instead of the Ford logo. Adaptive cruise controls over here because that is now standard on every model, as is blind spot monitoring. And then over here on this side, we have the controls for that multifunction display, as well as track forward, backward, and then you'll find the volume up down buttons over there on that side. Working our way down the center console, we find two big air vents there, the engine start stop button, and a button bank that is a combination of physical and touch buttons. So this entire button bank is one physical button. You can actually see it moving there, and then it knows which option you have selected by where you've touched on that display. Handy touch here is that we have a camera button to take us to the 360-degree camera system that we find in the vehicle, and it has some off-road modes. So it's going to show you your tracks as you're driving along, so it's really easy to tell exactly where the front of the vehicle is going. The center console has an assist handle over here on the passenger side, blocked off over here on the driver's side to help keep things from falling into the footwell. We have a big Qi wireless charging mat there, USB inputs, 12-volt power port as well, rotary style shifter there with auto brake hold, electric parking brake, and of course the all-wheel drive controls here. Most important of which is going to be this rear locker, the four-wheel drive lock button, which is going to command more power to the rear, the rear locker, part of that twin clutch unit in the back, and the GOAT modes here. And of course, Sasquatch is going to include some new off-road modes, including the rock crawl, the rally mode, and all of those modes are accompanied by new animations over here in this full LCD instrument cluster. And depending on which modes you engage, the four-wheel drive lock and the rear locker may automatically lock or unlock depending on those options. We find a soft touch center armrest with a reasonable amount of storage right there. In the back seats, we find these cool little zipper storage compartments. That's kind of nice. And then these little hooks here where you can add on additional accessories. If you're wondering what the Outer Banks model looks like on the inside, this is actually my favorite trim. We have different upholstery selections here, different fabric insert on the top, and the Bronco logo is a little bit more front and center in this particular seat design. And then we have non-perforated inserts for the bulk of the seat. Of course, darker door panels in this particular model with those brown and bronze accents in plastic and in that pleather. And then over here on the dashboard, we have more of a stylish surround on that same big LCD, and that also separates the infotainment system from the instrument cluster there as well. So fortunately, we've been able to take the new Bronco Sport a little bit off-road here on some of the trails at the new Bronco Off-Rodeo out here in Tennessee. The bulk of the Bronco's drivetrain remains the same as before, but the big change, of course, is that we now have greater availability of that really innovative twin clutch rear axle unit. And that's really what separates the Bronco Sport from the competition. We'll show you a little bit more about that in just a moment, but essentially the twin clutch unit can act either as a torque vectoring unit or effectively as a limited slip or even locking rear differential. And we don't find any capability like that in the competition. Remember, of course, that the Jeep Cherokee has sailed off into the sunset for at least a year, leaving only the Compass as a competitor in this particular segment. And the Compass never received the low ratio or the rear locker that we did find in the larger Jeep. As far as drivetrain performance, we still have the 1.5-liter turbo and the 2-liter turbo, so you do have the choice of two different power levels in the Bronco Sport, and you can effectively get the Sasquatch package complete with either engine depending on the trim level you're looking at. Whether you want the Badlands trim for more power or you want the Outer Banks trim for the more efficient 1.5-liter engine, you have the choice, but you get essentially the same kind of ground clearance, tire setup, and underbody protection. Of course, absolute grip numbers and braking distances are going to change because of the tire, and the tire difference is definitely one thing you should keep in mind as well. Versus something like the Subaru Wilderness Crosstrek, the tires that we have on the Bronco Sport from the factory in this new trim are definitely significantly more aggressive. We'll also take a look at those in just a second. Although certainly important for factory performance, tires are a little bit less important, I would say, in general, because you could always swap out a more aggressive tire on the competition, but you're not going to be able to swap in a locking differential in that Crosstrek. And then, of course, we have the front view camera here, which is definitely going to be a big advantage in some off-roading situations where you really want to see exactly what's going on in front of you, because that has a much better view than I do over the hood of the vehicle. Of course, the Bronco Sport doesn't have an enormously long hood, so that does really help. The tighter dimensions here are going to make this easier to off-road than some of those larger vehicles that you might be cross-shopping. In addition to the functionality of the rear differential, we also have different stability and traction control software in something like the Bronco Sport. And that's another big difference between this and something like the average RAV4 or the CR-V, because this traction control system is not just going to try and cut power here and there. In fact, in the off-road oriented modes, it's not going to respond to loss in traction by cutting power as a first effort. Instead, it's going to try and move the power around left to right, which is exactly what you want in order to get out of a sticky situation. If you were to compare that against the average small crossover in the US, they would generally default to removing power from the equation, and that's exactly what you're going to need to get out of the mud. Now, as far as general trail behavior goes, I have to say that Ford's done a really good job with throttle modulation especially. That's something I really noticed back there, not just in the mogul section, but also uphill in this area here through the mud, etc. This doesn't have a jumpy throttle like you do find in, for instance, a Range Rover Evoque. The Evoque obviously is, a lot more expensive than the Bronco Sport, but they're right about the same size. And of course, it also has off-road nature baked into its DNA, but not quite as much as we find in this Bronco Sport. We certainly find a lot less mechanical capability and a lot less underbody protection in that Range Rover. Now let's go on the outside and take a look at this all-wheel drive system in motion here. You'll really notice the difference back here in the rear. We have the locker on, and it's incredibly obvious because that rear tire is spinning at the exact same rate as the other side. And that's not what we would see in an open differential. In an open differential, the tire without the traction would really start to spin up, and then you'd get a lot less traction, obviously. Then you'd have the brakes engaging that would try and send power across to the other side. That results in brake overheating if you're really doing this kind of off-roading all day long. So this is not just going to give you better functionality, it's also going to save your brakes. In situations like this, you'll really notice the extra underbody protection that we have in the Bronco Sport. I'll show you those panels in just a second, but we have more significant coverage under the vehicle and more rugged panels for protecting the critical components. The nice tidy dimensions on the Bronco Sport and the increased ground clearance are also really obvious. You can actually hear those skid panels being used underneath the Bronco Sport as it's slamming on the rocks. The skid plates don't just protect the engine and the transmission in this vehicle or the front and rear bumper, they're also protecting the entire fuel system. So not just the gas tank, but also the evaporative emissions system under there. Now, as we get up on this rock over here, you'll also again really notice that locking rear differential functionality. You can of course leave it in its limited slip mode, or you can lock it via that button right there on the dashboard that we showed you earlier. But as we just let him come up on this rock here, we'll then have him pause for just a second when he's up there at the very top. But again, you can really see that rear wheel kicking up. No brake-based system is functioning here. That's just that twin clutch unit happening. So I'll just go ahead and have him pause here for just a second so I can show you around. If we take a look back here, you'll notice the massive skid plates back there in the rear. They cover not just the rear bumper section, but also that critical area there for the departure angle. And then if you come around the side here, you'll notice that up here in this area, we have the complete bash panels for the entire fuel system. That's another really critical touch. Then of course we have the skid plates further up front there as well. If you want to add things like rock rails, things like that aftermarket, those you can do yourself, but they're not going to come from the factory, at least for the moment, in the Bronco Sport. Now of course, sending power across the front axle is done via a brake-based system, but that's going to be a little bit less important than the rear locker functionality. And that's exactly why we see so many vehicles out there that have just a rear locker, not a front locker, because you really have to go to situations that are considerably more extreme than this before you actually need that front locker. Now, I love it when car companies are willing to throw a little bit of shade at the competition. So let's take a look at some of the competitive parts here. Keep in mind, of course, that you can add anything you want aftermarket. So here we're talking about from the factory performance. One of the biggest differences in terms of off-road performance for the Bronco Sport really is going to be the different tire that we find here. It's significantly more aggressive than the tires that we find in the Jeep Compass or in the RAV4 TRD off-road. Just look at the tread pattern difference right there. We have a quote-unquote all-terrain tire in the Subaru Wilderness, but you'll notice it's not the most aggressive off-road all-terrain tire. It's really more of a street touring tire, something like that. We do have skid panels, skid plates in the competition. It's a relatively thin one over here in the RAV4. Something we've talked about in the past is that the Crosstrek Wilderness actually has mostly a plastic aero panel underneath, and it just has a very tiny little piece of metal up front. But the panel that we have in the Ford, it's considerably more durable. It's also an awful lot heavier. And not only that, but it covers more of the underbody of the Bronco Sport. And in case you're wondering what the recovery hooks look like, this is what the internals actually look like. So this is the part that you get to see on the outside right there. This is how it mounts to the body and how it spreads those loads further into the unibody of the Bronco Sport. Things are definitely different in the competition. We do have very sturdy tow hooks in the Jeep. These are the Jeep's tow hooks right here, but they're not fully boxed like we find in the Bronco Sport. If you want to get your hands on the updated Bronco Sport, orders are going to be starting right around the time that you're watching this video, and delivery should happen in early 2025. Let me know what you guys think of the Bronco Sport. I think Ford did just enough to not only keep it competitive, but also help keep pricing in line with most of the competition. Let's talk about that now. Pricing is going to start just over $30,000, including destination, and it's going to run up into the mid-40s. That's pretty comparable to most of the competition, and the competition is really kind of tricky to talk about because this is smaller on the outside in terms of its length and its width than a lot of the competition in the compact segment, but because it's so much taller in the back and so much boxier, it ultimately is more practical than something like a RAV4 or even something like a CR-V, depending on exactly how much you want to stuff on the inside across the cabin. It is certainly much more boxy and practical than something like the Subaru Crosstrek, because the Crosstrek is, it's honestly more of a lifted hatchback. There is actually a Subaru Impreza hatchback that has the exact same body, just not as lifted. So it depends on whether you want something that's a bit more car-like, that driving experience, or you want something a bit more SUV-like, a bit boxier, like the Bronco Sport. Now, when it comes to capability, the Bronco Sport simply stands alone. Nothing else in this segment offers a limited slip rear differential, let alone the locking functionality or the additional drive mode and traction management systems that we find in this model. I know a lot of folks out there love their traction management systems in modern Subarus, and indeed it's pretty great out on snow, out on your average surface, but if you really want to take your small SUV further off the beaten path, if you want to do more true off-roading, you need something like this, because the lack of rear locker in the Jeep and in the Subaru and in really everything else out there puts this in a category all of its own. We find somewhat similar functionality in certain versions of the Toyota RAV4, but Toyota has never been as aggressive at locking that rear differential as we find in the Bronco Sport. Yes, it gives you limited slip functionality in the back, but it does not lock like this rear differential can, and that makes a big, big difference out on a trail. Let us know what you think about all that down there in the comments section below. And, should we trade in the Grenadier long-term for something like the Bronco Sport? Because the timing actually could be about right. We're actually going to be getting rid of that Ineos Grenadier towards the end of this year. And, we don't know exactly what's going to take its place in the garage. So be sure and vote down there in the comments section below. And again, if you want to get your hands on one of these, reach out to your dealer soon, because these are going to be on sale shortly.